There are moments in a person's life that do not announce themselves as turning points. They arrive dressed as ordinary grief, as legal paperwork, as a folding table in a lawyer's conference room with bad lighting and lukewarm coffee. They look like family. They sound like voices you have known your entire life, and they carry within them the quiet devastation of being underestimated by the people who were supposed to know you best. Nora Callahan was 39 years old the morning she sat across from her two older brothers in the offices of Whitmore and Associates and learned what she was worth to the family she had grown up inside of. She had driven 2 hours to get there, leaving before her daughter woke up, stopping once for gas and once for a cup of coffee she barely touched. The drive had been gray and flat, and the kind of early morning that withholds light as if testing whether you have the patience to wait for it. She had dressed carefully, not because she expected ceremony, but because she understood without being told that her brothers would be dressed well, and she did not want to give them anything additional to use. She wore a dark blazer over a simple blouse. Her hair was pulled back. Her boots were clean. She had checked herself in the bathroom mirror of the gas station and held her own gaze for a moment longer than was strictly necessary before looking away. The conference room smelled of old carpet and artificial lemon. Harold Whitmore, the estate attorney who had handled her father's affairs for the better part of 2 decades, and sat at the head of the table with the careful neutrality of a man accustomed to presiding over the worst behavior that blood could produce. He had known the Callahan family since before Nora was born. If that history moved him now, he did not allow it to show. Gerald sat to his right. Gerald was the eldest by 11 years, a man whose certainty about his own judgment had calcified over decades into something no longer distinguishable from arrogance. He had spent 30 years in commercial real estate and had developed the habit of assessing everything around him in terms of its potential resale value, including, Nora had long suspected, the people in his life. His suit was charcoal gray and pressed. He sat the way he always sat, slightly forward, elbows on the table, hands loosely clasped, and a posture that suggested he was already in the middle of an important decision. Thomas sat beside him. Thomas was 6 years younger than Gerald and 4 years older than Nora, and he occupied a space between his two siblings that he had always managed with a careful, practiced ease. He was quieter than Gerald, but no less calculating, his particular talent being the ability to let Gerald assume the lead in any confrontation while remaining close enough to collect the benefits. He held a cup of coffee in both hands and watched the door when Nora entered, rather than watching her directly. She sat across from them without speaking and set her bag on the floor beside her chair. Whitmore cleared his throat and opened the folder in front of him. Her father's name had been Robert Callahan. Then he had died 7 weeks earlier after a brief illness that had moved faster than any of them had been prepared for. He was 74 years old, a man of plain habits and considered speech, the kind of person who measured words the way a carpenter measures wood, twice before committing. He had built a modest business in industrial supply over several decades, accumulated property through patience and frugality, and carried within him a silence about certain subjects that his children had learned early in life not to press. Nora had been the one who sat with him during the final weeks. Not because her brothers were absent, they were not. They came, they called, they arranged things, but because she was the one he had asked for. She did not know precisely why, and she had been careful not to interpret it as favoritism while he was still alive. She simply came when he called and sat beside him in the afternoons and listened to him talk about things she had not known he remembered, old properties, old decisions, a particular summer when he was a younger man and the world had seemed to him full of hidden possibilities. He was not a sentimental person by nature, and so those conversations had stayed with her in the weeks after his death with a weight she could not quite articulate. She had not thought much about the estate before the meeting. That was perhaps naive, and she recognized it in hindsight. But she had been occupied with her daughter, with the drive, with the quiet logistics of grief, and she had not allowed herself to think too carefully about what came next. What came next? And it turned out had been planned with considerable precision. Whitmore read the document in the measured tone of a man who had done this many times. The estate had been updated 18 months before Robert's death, a detail that registered somewhere at the base of Nora's spine as he spoke. The business assets and the investment accounts, the larger of which contained nearly $4 million, were to be divided equally between Gerald and Thomas. The family home, a property in the north of the county that had been in the family for 40 years and that Nora had grown up inside, was to be transferred to Gerald, with provisions for its maintenance and eventual sale at his discretion. Several smaller financial instruments went to Thomas. There were charitable bequests, modest but genuine, to two organizations her father had supported quietly for years. And then there was a plot of land. Whitmore described it with the same even tone he had used throughout. A parcel of just over half an acre in the southern end of the county, separate from the family home, accessed by a private road shared with two neighboring properties. The land was undeveloped except for a tool shed that had stood on the eastern boundary of the parcel for some decades. It was assessed for tax purposes at a value of slightly under $22,000, a figure that included the land itself. The shed was not separately appraised. This parcel and its structure were bequeathed to Nora. Gerald did not move when it was read aloud. Thomas looked down at his coffee. Whitmore continued, turning a page, moving to the final items. Nora sat very still, and she was aware in that moment of the particular quality of silence that a room produces when something has just been decided and everyone present already knew what it was going to be. It was not the silence of surprise. It was the silence of confirmation. Her brothers had known. They had perhaps always known. The months of careful arrangements, the attorneys, the updated documents, all of it had been moving toward this moment with the quiet, unstoppable momentum of a conclusion reached long before the meeting began. She did not cry. She did not raise her voice. She sat with her hands in her lap and listened as Whitmore concluded and asked if there were questions. Gerald spoke first. He asked about a timeline for the transfer of the business assets and the tax implications of certain instruments. His voice was courteous and businesslike, and he did not look at Nora. Thomas asked a follow-up question about the charitable bequests. He used the word procedural. Nora asked for a copy of the document. Whitmore nodded and made a note. She left before her brothers did, declining Whitmore's offer to linger over the paperwork. She retrieved her bag from the floor beside her chair, thanked the attorney with a brevity that she hoped did not betray what it cost her, and walked out of the conference room through the quiet corridor and out through the glass front door of the office building into the gray morning. She sat in her car in the parking lot for a long time without starting the engine. The thoughts did not come in an organized way. They came the way things come when the architecture of a belief you have held for a long time suddenly shifts, in fragments, in images, in the particular quality of light through the kitchen window of the family home on winter mornings when she was young, and her father was already at the table, and the world seemed contained and reliable. In the memory of her daughter's face the previous evening as she put her to bed, serious and questioning in the way that children are when they sense something large is happening nearby. In the sound of Gerald's voice in the conference room, asking about timelines, as though the meeting had been a business transaction he was now ready to move past. She had known, on some level, that things would not be equal. She had grown up in a family where equality between siblings was spoken of more often than it was practiced, and she had made her peace with that asymmetry over years. But what she had not fully allowed herself to prepare for was the precision of it, the surgical quality of the division, the fact that someone, her father or her brothers, or some combination of the three, had sat down and calculated exactly how little could be given to her while still giving something. A half-acre, a shed worth less than the annual cost of her daughter's school supplies. She was not poor, exactly. She worked as a bookkeeper for a small manufacturing company 2 towns over, a job that paid adequately and demanded very little of her beyond precision and consistency, 2 qualities she had in abundance. She paid her rent without drama. She kept her car maintained. She had a savings account that she added to whenever the month allowed, which was not as often as she would have liked. She had raised her daughter, Margot, and alone for 7 years since the end of a marriage that had not been vicious so much as simply unsustainable, and she had done it without complaint because complaint had never struck her as a productive use of energy. But she was not comfortable in the way her brothers were comfortable. She did not have the cushion that comes from decades of accumulation. She did not have a margin. She lived as she had for most of her adult life, at the exact distance from financial stability where a single large and unexpected expense could reorganize everything. She had hoped, in a way she had never fully admitted to herself until this moment, that her father might have understood that, might have accounted for it, not out of favoritism or sentiment, but out of the same careful practicality that had governed every other decision of his life. Instead, that he had given her a shed. She started the car and drove. The land was not something she had visited in years. Her father had acquired it in the early part of his career, during a period of modest expansion when he had been buying small parcels in the area as long-term holds, properties that could be developed later, or simply held as assets in a period when land in that region was inexpensive enough to make the strategy viable. Some of those parcels he had sold over the years. Others he had retained without apparent plan, as if unwilling to commit fully to the idea that they would never be needed. The parcel in question was one she vaguely remembered being driven past as a child, once or twice, her father pointing through the car window at a stretch of fence line and saying something brief and unremarkable about it. She had not thought of it in the intervening decades. It had not been a place anyone talked about. It had simply existed at the edge of the family's geographic consciousness, a footnote to more significant holdings. She did not drive there that day. She drove home instead, let herself into the apartment she rented on the 2nd floor of a building 3 blocks from Margot's school, and sat at the kitchen table with a glass of water and the copy of the estate document Whitmore had handed her at the door. She read it in full, carefully, the way she read every document placed in front of her. She was looking for errors, for ambiguities, for anything that might suggest the division had been imprecise. There were no errors. The document was meticulous. Harold Whitmore had earned his fees. She set it on the table and looked at the wall above the window. A calendar hung there, the current month displayed, a few dates circled in red marker, a dentist appointment, a parent-teacher conference, a reminder to call the mechanic about the noise the car had started making in cold weather. The ordinary architecture of her life, organized against a white square of paper. She thought about her father's voice in those last weeks, the way he had talked about that particular summer when he was young. She had not asked him to explain himself. She had simply listened. She had always been a listener rather than a questioner, a quality that had served her well in most areas of her life and had occasionally cost her dearly in others. She went to bed early that night and lay awake for a long time, listening to the building settle around her in the dark. 3 weeks passed before she went to see the land. They were weeks of practical matters, of finalizing her portion of the estate process, of signing documents and providing account details and going through the quiet, bureaucratic rhythm that follows death. She spoke to Gerald once, briefly, when he called to discuss a shared item in the estate that required her signature. He was civil. He did not mention the distribution. She did not raise it. They concluded the call in under 4 minutes. Thomas sent a text message the following week, asking whether she was doing all right, a question that felt sufficiently vague to require no specific answer. She replied that she was fine, because she was in the way that people are fine when they have chosen to be. Now, she did not speak to anyone about what she had received from the estate. She told Margot that there had been some land and a small building left to her, using the same tone she used when explaining complicated adult matters, which was a tone of plain factual calm that Margot, who was 11 and perceptive in the way that children of single parents often are, received with a nod and did not press further. The drive to the parcel took 40 minutes on a morning in early spring, when the weather had turned clear and cold after a week of rain. The roads in the southern part of the county were narrow and familiar in the way of roads that have not changed in decades, flanked by bare-limbed trees and occasional stretches of fieldstone wall running alongside unfenced land. She navigated by the description in the legal document, which listed the parcel's boundaries with reference to road names and neighboring property numbers, and found the private access road without difficulty. She stopped at the gate. It was a simple metal gate, the kind found on working farms, painted green at some point in the distant past, most of that paint now reduced to a faint undertone beneath rusted silver. A padlock held it closed, and the key attached to the envelope of documents that Whitmore had given her fitted without difficulty. The lock was stiff but functional. The gate swung inward with a sound that seemed disproportionately loud in the quiet of the morning. The lane that ran from the gate to the property was unpaved, its surface a combination of packed earth and gravel that had been supplemented at irregular intervals over the years and never consolidated into anything approaching a formal road. It ran straight for about 80 meters, then curved slightly where a large oak had grown across the intended path at some point in the past and been accommodated rather than removed. Nora drove slowly, the car rocking over the uneven surface, and parked where the lane widened into a rough clearing beside the shed. She sat in the car for a moment after shutting off the engine. The land was quiet. Bird sounds reached her, and the distant sound of wind moving through the tops of the trees at the property's perimeter. Closer in, nothing moved. The air through the cracked window was cold and clean, carrying with it the smell of wet earth and bark and the very faint sweetness of something she could not name. She got out. The half-acre spread out around the shed in an irregular shape, its boundaries marked by a fence that was still largely intact on two sides and had collapsed at intervals on the third. The land itself was rough and overgrown, unmaintained for what appeared to be many years, perhaps decades. Tufts of coarse grass grew knee-high in places. A thicket of bramble had established itself in the northwestern corner with the territorial confidence of something that expected to stay. Saplings had pushed up through the ground in scattered clusters, their trunks narrow but already producing the particular vertical insistence of trees that intend to become permanent. None of this was a surprise. She had not expected the land to be in good condition, and she had not brought the kind of optimism that required good condition in order to function. She turned to the shed. It was larger than she had expected, though not by a dramatic margin. Larger, perhaps, than the word sheet implied, larger than the figure in the estate document had suggested something of so little value should be. It measured perhaps 12 meters in length and 8 in width, a footprint more like a small garage than an outbuilding. It was built from timber, the boards darkened to the color of old iron by years of weather, their surfaces split in places by the expansion and contraction of seasons. A corrugated metal roof, its color indeterminate beneath a thick layer of moss and debris, sloped toward the rear of the structure. 2 windows occupied the front face, and their glass intact on one side and entirely absent on the other. The empty frame boarded over from inside with a piece of plywood that had warped badly in the moisture. The main entrance was a set of wide double doors, the kind designed to allow equipment to pass through, with 2 standard hinges on each side, one of which had separated partially from the frame. A newer padlock held the doors shut, its brass casing significantly less weathered than the wood around it. That detail arrested her attention briefly. Someone had replaced the lock within the last several years. Not recently enough to suggest active use, but recently enough to suggest something. She used the second key from the envelope, and the lock opened cleanly. She pushed the right door inward. The smell that met her was the smell of all old closed structures, the layered dust and trapped moisture and the faint organic decay of wood that has been slowly processing its own age. She stood in the doorway until her eyes adjusted to the interior light, which was thin and directional, admitted through the single intact window and the gaps between boards where the timber had shrunk away from itself. The shed was mostly empty. That registered first, before anything else. For a structure of its size, the interior held remarkably little. A long workbench ran along the left wall, its surface bare. Above it, a pegboard still held a few rusted tools, their outlines ghostly against the lighter wood of the board. A set of metal shelving units occupied the back wall, empty, their surfaces dusty but structurally sound. In one corner stood a heavy cast-iron vise, the kind used in serious woodworking or metalwork, bolted permanently to a secondary bench that jutted from the right wall. The vise itself was large, its jaws open and coated in rust, and the bench it was anchored to was considerably more solidly constructed than the primary workbench. On the floor, in the center of the space, were the remains of what appeared to have been a tarpaulin, degraded by years into a brittle arrangement of coated fabric that crumbled when she stepped near it. Beneath it, barely visible, was a dark stain on the concrete floor, oil or grease from some piece of equipment long since removed. She walked the length of the space slowly, her footsteps producing a particular sound against the concrete floor, sharp and clear, the sound of a space with no soft furnishings to absorb it. The workbench was solid under her hand, the wood thick and well-jointed. Whoever had built it had not built it carelessly. She noted the construction of the shelving units in the same way she noted figures in a ledger, not assigning value yet, simply recording what was present. When she reached the back wall, she stopped. The shelving units sat flush against the wall, or appeared to. There were 3 of them, each perhaps 2 meters wide and reaching almost to the low ceiling. They were constructed from angle iron, the kind that could be assembled and adjusted, and they had been bolted to the wall at the top with brackets. Standard enough for the type. What was not standard was the gap. She noticed it as a shadow rather than a space, a strip of darkness running vertically along the right edge of the rightmost shelving unit, consistent and perfectly even from floor to ceiling. She did not immediately understand what she was looking at. She looked at it for a moment, with the calm attention of someone who has been trained by years of working with numbers to notice when something does not add up. And then she crouched and looked at the floor. The concrete beneath the shelving unit was clean. Not clean in the way of a surface that had been swept, but clean in the specific way that a surface becomes when something moves regularly across it, when contact prevents the accumulation of dust. The faint scrape marks were subtle, and she might easily have dismissed them. But she had noticed the gap first, and now the marks confirmed what the gap had already suggested. The shelving unit had been moved, recently and repeatedly. She stood up and looked at the unit carefully. Its bolts were still seated in their brackets at the top, suggesting it was anchored. She pressed against the unit experimentally, first at the center, then toward the right edge. At the right edge, something shifted. A fraction of a millimeter, barely perceptible, but present. Like the suggestion of a word spoken just beneath the threshold of hearing. She did not push further. She stepped back and looked at the wall. The timber boards that formed the shed's rear exterior wall were consistent in their weathering, uniformly dark, uniformly aged. But behind the shelving units, she could not see the wall. The shelving blocked it. She thought about the gap along the right edge of the unit, the clean floor, the fractional movement. She thought about the structure of the shed itself, which was larger than it needed to be for the purposes it appeared to serve, larger than almost any storage function required. She thought about the new padlock on the door. She thought about her father, sitting in a hospital bed in the last weeks of his life. talking about a particular summer when the world had seemed full of hidden possibilities. She stayed in the shed for another 20 minutes, moving through the space methodically, touching surfaces and noting construction details, not yet pressing on anything again, not yet pulling anything open. She was not ready to do that today. She was not the kind of person who acted on instinct without first allowing instinct to settle into something more considered. The gap along the shelving unit's edge would be there tomorrow. The clean floor would be there tomorrow. When she left, now she locked the door behind her with the brass padlock and walked back to the car through the cold air of the morning. She sat in the driver's seat with the engine off for a moment, looking at the shed through the windshield. It sat there in the thin light, its weathered face offering nothing, its new lock catching the small light there was, with a faint, incongruous shine. She drove home. That evening, after Margot was in bed and the apartment had settled into its nighttime quiet, Nora sat at the kitchen table with the estate document in front of her and a notebook beside it, the kind she used for accounts, its pages ruled in pale blue lines. She wrote down everything she had noticed inside the shed in her careful, economical hand. The dimensions, approximately, the construction of the bench, the pegboard, the shelving units, the gap on the clean floor, the fractional movement. She wrote it the way she would write a discrepancy in a ledger, without conclusion, without excitement, without the kind of forward-leaning anticipation that could distort observation. Simply as facts, recorded in the order she had encountered them. Then she looked at the list for a long time. There was something she had not included, something that resisted the plainness of a notebook entry. It was not a fact so much as a quality of the space. The shed had felt, when she was inside it, not entirely empty. Not in a way that suggested presence or occupation, nothing so irrational as that, but in the way that a drawer feels when it contains something you cannot see from the front, weighted in a direction that does not account for what is visible. She closed the notebook. She thought about Gerald's voice in the conference room, asking about timelines. She thought about Thomas with his hands around the coffee cup. She thought about the document, meticulous and complete, that had given her brothers the money and the property and the history of the family, and had given her a half-acre and a shed assessed at slightly under $22,000. She thought about the new padlock. Someone had replaced that lock. It was not the first lock, not an original fitting from the years when the shed was actively used. It was newer, installed with intention, on a structure that no one, by any reasonable assessment, had reason to secure. You did not put a new lock on a shed full of rusted tools and empty shelving unless the shed contained something worth locking. Her brothers had assessed the land during the estate process. Whitmore had said as much, that all properties had been evaluated for the purposes of equitable distribution. She understood now what that word had meant in context. Equitable, as her brothers and their attorneys had defined it. An assessment of land and structure that had arrived at $22,000 and been accepted without question as the measure of what this piece of property was worth. She wondered whether Gerald had driven out to see it. She wondered whether he had gone inside. She wondered, and then she stopped wondering, because wondering was not the same as knowing, and she had learned long ago that the distance between those two things was best crossed by going back and looking more carefully at what was actually there. She would return to the shed. She would bring tools. She would bring light. She would look behind the shelving unit at the gap along the right edge, and she would follow what she found with the same careful attention she brought to everything else in her life, not because she expected to find anything remarkable, not because she was driven by the particular kind of desperate hope that distorts perception, but because something in that space did not account for itself, and she had never been able to leave an account that did not balance. She put the notebook away, rinsed her glass, and turned off the kitchen light. The spring night outside the window was clear, the stars very faint through the ambient light of the town, the air still carrying the chill of a season that had not quite committed to arriving. Somewhere in the dark of the southern part of the county, A 40 minutes down quiet roads, a shed stood on a half-acre of overgrown land with a new padlock on its door and a shelving unit that moved when pressed at the right edge. She did not yet know what that meant, but she had learned in her life that the things most worth knowing were rarely announced in advance. They waited in the gaps, in the slight shadows, in the marginal difference between what a surface shows and what a surface contains. They waited for the kind of attention that did not flinch and did not rush. She was capable of that kind of attention. She had always been capable of it. It was the only inheritance she had ever been sure of. The second visit happened on a Saturday, 10 days after the first. She chose Saturday because Margot was at a friend's house and would not return until late afternoon, that which gave her time to go without explanation or company. She had thought carefully about whether to tell anyone where she was going and had decided, without fully articulating the reason to herself, not to. It was not a secret she was keeping. It was simply a matter she preferred to understand herself before sharing it with anyone else. She brought a flashlight with a fresh set of batteries, a pry bar from the small collection of tools she kept in the apartment's utility closet, a measuring tape, and a pair of work gloves. She also brought her notebook, though she was aware that this visit might not generate the kind of precise entries she was accustomed to making. The drive out was quiet. The morning was warmer than the previous visit, early spring making its first genuine commitment. The sky high and pale blue over fields beginning to show the first green of the season. The gate opened without difficulty, the lock still responding cleanly to the brass key. She drove up the lane and parked in the same spot as before. The shed looked exactly as it had. Weather dark, settled, its moss-covered roof carrying the same tired weight, its intact window catching the same thin light. The new padlock on the double doors seemed, in the morning light, slightly more out of place than she had remembered. It had the look of something recently inserted into a context it had not grown up in, the way a new word in a familiar text draws the eye. She opened the lock and pushed the right door inward. The smell was the same, dust and old wood, and contained time. The interior was exactly as she had left it, nothing disturbed. At the tools on the pegboard, unchanged, the shelving unit standing against the back wall with the same precise wrongness she had noted before. She started at the shelving unit. She moved the flashlight along the right edge first, confirming the gap she had seen before. In the clearer light she brought with her now, it was more definitively a gap than it had appeared during the first visit, a consistent vertical space of perhaps 2 centimeters running from the base of the unit to where it met the ceiling, perfectly even, suggesting that the unit and whatever was behind it maintained the same relationship throughout their full height. The kind of evenness that came not from accident, but from a hinge or a track. She examined the bolts at the top of the unit. They were seated in their brackets with what appeared to be solidity. She studied them more closely and found, on closer inspection, that they were not tightened fully into the wall. They were threaded only partially, resting in their positions more from gravity and friction than from structural commitment. They would appear to a cursory examination to be anchored. They were not. She put her hand on the right edge of the unit and pressed. The unit pivoted. It moved on a point somewhere left of center, swinging the right edge forward and the left edge backward simultaneously, a motion so smooth and so counterintuitive that she felt her breath leave her body for a full second before she could replace it. The movement was slow and heavy, the weight of the unit demanding effort. But the mechanics of it were perfectly engineered, a pivot point set into the floor at the unit's center, a concealed track running in a shallow groove in the concrete that guided the swing without resistance. Behind the unit, where the wall of the shed should have been, was a door. She stood and looked at it. It was not elaborate. It was a plain door, solid core by the weight it implied even from a distance, set flush into a timber frame that was part of the shed's structural interior, not its exterior wall. The exterior wall continued behind and beyond it, but the door stood before it. accessing something in the space between the shed's visible interior and its exterior boards. A space that should not have existed in a structure of these dimensions. A space she had not noticed because she had not been looking for something hidden within the dimensions themselves. The door was fitted with a simple lever handle and had no visible lock. She reached out and pressed the handle downward. It opened. The air that met her was different from the shed's air. Drier, cooler, carrying no trace of the organic warmth that old wood produces even in its decay. It was a still, preserved air, the kind that exists in spaces that have been sealed rather than simply closed, spaces where the exchange with the outside world has been deliberately and successfully interrupted. She raised the flashlight. The beam reached into the space beyond the door and found a room. It was not large. Perhaps 4 meters by 6, its walls poured concrete rather than timber, its floor the same. The ceiling was low, perhaps 2.5 meters, fitted with a light fixture whose bulb was long since dead. Shelving ran along 3 walls, these shelves built from timber rather than metal. Their construction careful and precise, the kind of work done by someone who intended it to last. And on the shelves, arranged with a neatness that spoke of careful placement over considerable time, were boxes. They were not uniform. They ranged from small, flat cases, no larger than a hardback book, to medium-sized containers the approximate dimensions of a shoebox. Some were wooden, fitted with brass clasps. Others were hard-sided cases of the kind used to transport instruments or valuables, their latches intact. Several were wrapped in oilcloth, tied with cord. A few sat in clear plastic protective sleeves of a type she had seen used for archival storage. There were perhaps 60 of them, perhaps more. She did not count yet. She stood in the doorway of the room for a long time without moving, and the flashlight beam moved from shelf to shelf, from case to case, absorbing what it found without judgment. Her hand was steady. She noticed that her hand was steady and found that fact remarkable in a way she filed away for later. She stepped inside. The first case she opened was one of the wooden ones, small and flat, its brass clasp releasing without resistance. Inside, nested in a fitted interior of aged velvet, the color of dark moss, lay a row of stones. She had not brought a jeweler's loupe, and she did not have the training to appraise what she was looking at with technical authority, but she had eyes, and she was looking at diamonds. Cut and faceted and arranged in a row with the careful deliberation of objects that someone understood to be valuable. Their surfaces caught the flashlight and broke it into points clean and precise, dozens of small, perfect fires in the beam of her light. She closed the case gently, set it back on the shelf, opened the next one. More stones. She worked along the first shelf, opening cases methodically, one by one. Diamonds in every configuration she could name, and several she could not. Rough stones alongside cut ones. Stones of considerable size alongside smaller ones of what appeared, even to her untrained eye, to be exceptional clarity. Some cases held what appeared to be sorted lots, stones of similar size grouped together. Others held single pieces of such size that she had to set the flashlight down and hold them toward the beam with both hands to take in their dimensions. She opened 12 cases on the first shelf before she stopped. She stood in the middle of the concrete room, in the dry, still air, out with the flashlight beam resting on the shelves around her, and she waited for the feeling of disbelief that she expected to arrive. It did not arrive in the form she expected. What came instead was something quieter and more unsettling, a kind of recognition, as if some part of her had known. Not that she would find exactly this, but that the space behind the shelving unit would not turn out to be nothing, that the new padlock would not turn out to be meaningless, that her father's voice, talking about hidden possibilities in a summer-long past, had not been the mere reminiscence of an aging man, but something closer to a disclosure, offered in the only form he knew how to give it. She sat down on the concrete floor with her back against the shelving and her knees drawn up and her hands in her lap. And then she breathed in the dry, still air of the room her father had built, and she allowed herself to understand, slowly and without rushing, that the thing she was sitting inside of would change every calculation she had ever made. Outside, 40 minutes up the quiet road, her brothers were living inside the inheritance they had taken from a divided estate. Inside the conference room of Whitmore and Associates, the documents were already filed, the transfers already in motion, the decision already settled into the permanent past. They had given her the tool shed. She sat in what the tool shed contained, in the dry air her father had preserved, beside the boxes he had arranged with care on shelves he had built to last, and she thought about the word equitable and what it required to be true. And the diamonds caught the light of her flashlight and held it quietly, asking nothing, offering nothing beyond what they were. That was already considerable. She was not yet ready to measure how considerable. That would come later. What she needed now, in this moment, in this room beneath the floor of the life she had been handed, was simply to sit with the fact of it, to let it settle into her without flinching, without urgency, without the particular kind of performance that discovery sometimes demands of people who have an audience. She had no audience. She was alone in a room full of diamonds at the end of a private lane on a half-acre of overgrown land in the southern part of the county, and the only person who had ever known this room existed was 7 weeks dead, and he had not told her brothers about it. He had given it to her. She stayed in the room for a long time. When she finally rose and walked back through the door and pushed the shelving unit back into its position and closed the shed behind her and locked the brass padlock and walked back to her car through the thin spring light, she did so with the particular steadiness that comes not from certainty about what comes next, but from the knowledge that what you are carrying is real and yours, and will still be there when you are ready to return to it. She drove home. She needed to think. She needed to be careful. She needed to understand what she had found before the world found out that she had found it. And she needed, perhaps most of all, to resist the temptation to call her brothers, not with anger, not with triumph, but with the single question that had been forming in her chest since the moment the shelving unit had pivoted on its hidden point and shown her what was behind it. Did you know? She did not call them. She drove home through the pale spring afternoon, and she did not call anyone, and she held the knowledge of the room inside her like a stone held in the center of the hand, feeling its weight, learning its shape, deciding very carefully what to do with it. She did not sleep well that night, but not in the way she would have expected. There was no racing heart, no compulsive replaying of the image of the diamonds under the flashlight, no urgent mental arithmetic building towers of imagined value. Those things would come later, in their own form and their own time. What kept her awake was something slower and more fundamental. At the quiet insistence of a question that refused to be set aside. How long had it been there? She lay in the dark and turned the question over the way you turn a stone in a creek bed, feeling its dimensions. The construction of the hidden room had required planning and time and skilled labor, or at the very least, one person with considerable knowledge of how to work concrete and timber. The shelving unit's pivot mechanism alone represented hours of engineering thought, the kind of work that did not happen impulsively. The room had been fitted with electrical wiring, even if the bulb was long dead. The shelving inside was built to standard rather than improvised. All of it pointed to a project undertaken deliberately and over time, not a hasty concealment, but a considered one. Her father had owned the parcel for over 40 years. She thought about what 40 years meant in the context of a hidden room. It meant that whatever her father had placed inside it had been placed in stages, perhaps over decades, the collection growing slowly, case by case, lot by lot, each addition made with the calm intention of someone who was building something rather than hiding from something. The distinction mattered to her. Fear built rooms differently than patience did. Fear built rooms in corners, in haste, in the kind of structural imprecision that revealed itself over time. What she had seen was not fear. It was architecture. It was the work of a man who had planned a long time ahead of his own need. She got up before 5 and made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table in the dark with the notebook open in front of her. She wrote down the questions she could not yet answer, setting them in a column on the left side of the page. Then, on the right side, she wrote down what she knew for certain, limiting herself strictly to fact and excluding inference. The left side was considerably longer than the right, which was, she recognized, exactly how the situation should look at this stage of understanding. What she knew. There was a concrete room behind the shelving unit in the shed. The room contained a large number of cases, boxes, and containers arranged on built shelving. The cases she had opened held what appeared to be cut and uncut diamonds. She had opened 12 cases out of an estimated total that might be as high as 60 or more. The room was dry and appeared well sealed. The shed had been fitted with a newer padlock at some point in the past several years. Well, what she did not know. The total number of cases, the contents of the unopened ones, whether the stones she had seen were genuine, their grade, their cut quality, their carat weights, their provenance. The origin of the collection, when it had been assembled, whether anyone other than her father had known of its existence, whether her brothers, or either of them, had been aware of the room when the estate was divided. That last question sat at the center of everything, and she underlined it twice without meaning to. She knew what it meant if they had known. It meant the division of the estate had not been merely tilted by preference or favoritism, the way family estates so often were, but had been deliberately constructed around a calculated deception. It meant the $22,000 assessment had not been a coincidence or a bureaucratic imprecision, but a conclusion reached by people who already knew it was wrong and accepted it anyway because it served them. She knew also what it meant if they had not known. It meant her father had kept the room from all of them equally. It meant the inequality of the estate division had been, in its own terrible logic, genuine. Gerald had received what he had received because her father valued him more, not because he had known enough to exclude the room from the accounting. It would mean the hidden collection was her father's final private act, made in full knowledge of what he was doing, offered not as correction for what the estate had failed to give her, but as something else entirely, something she did not yet have a word for. Neither possibility was comfortable. She sat with both of them in the pre-dawn quiet of the kitchen and did not try to resolve them. Resolution would come from evidence, not from speculation, and she had learned too many times in her working life that the mind's tendency to resolve uncertainty prematurely was one of the most reliable sources of error available to it. She went to work that morning and performed her job with the same precision she brought to it every day. She reconciled accounts. She flagged a discrepancy in a vendor invoice that turned out to be a billing error, modest in scale but real. She answered emails. She ate her lunch at her desk. No one who saw her that day would have known that the previous afternoon she had sat on a concrete floor in a hidden room and opened 12 boxes of diamonds. That was, she recognized, exactly as it should be. She began planning her return visit on the drive home. The planning was methodical because she was methodical, and because what she had found demanded method rather than impulse. She could not assess the room's contents alone. She lacked the technical knowledge to evaluate cut quality, to estimate carat weights with any precision, to distinguish between stones of significantly different grades. She needed expertise. But expertise required trust, and trust was the resource most difficult to secure when the thing being trusted was of uncertain and potentially enormous value. She thought about who she could call. The field of gemological assessment was narrow enough to require credentials, but wide enough to include people outside her immediate geography, and people who would have no connection to her family or its recent complications. She spent 2 evenings researching before she found what she was looking for. A certified independent appraiser based 3 states away, a woman named Dr. Patricia Fenwick, whose name appeared consistently in the records of estate appraisals and insurance valuations across a period of nearly 20 years. Her practice was described as specialized in high-value gemological assessment with particular experience in estate and collection contexts. Her certifications were legitimate and verifiable. She had testified in 3 court cases as an expert witness. She had no apparent connection to the Callahan family or to anything in Nora's county. Nora called her on a Tuesday morning from her car during a lunch break, parked in a lot 2 blocks from her office building. But she was direct without being specific. She described the situation as a recent inheritance involving what appeared to be a substantial gemological collection of unknown origin, which required thorough assessment for both legal and personal purposes, and which she needed handled with complete confidentiality. She explained that she was not yet in a position to allow the collection to be transported, and asked whether an on-site assessment was something Dr. Fenwick could accommodate. Dr. Fenwick asked 3 practical questions. What was the approximate volume of material to be assessed? Was the location secure and accessible? And what was the timeline she was working with? Nora answered that the volume was significant and the timeline flexible, that she had no interest in rushing a process she needed to understand fully. Dr. Fenwick's response suggested that she had heard this kind of careful, measured request before, and that she had learned to take it seriously. They agreed to a date 3 weeks out. In the intervening weeks, Nora returned to the shed 3 more times. Each visit was planned for a day when Margot was occupied, and the drive could be accomplished without comment. Each time she brought better equipment, a stronger flashlight, a hand counter, a measuring tape, a camera, a simple digital model she had purchased at a general goods store with cash, its images stored on a memory card she kept in her own possession. She photographed the room systematically. She photographed the shelves in sequence, capturing each case and container in place before touching it. She photographed the pivot mechanism of the shelving unit from multiple angles, and including the track in the concrete floor and the anchor point at the unit's center. She photographed the construction of the room itself, the quality of the concrete, the timber shelving, the electrical conduit, the sealed ventilation grill set into the ceiling at one end that explained, in part, how the air had stayed so dry. Then she began working through the cases. She did not rush. She worked from left to right along each shelf, opening each case or container in sequence, recording a description of its contents in her notebook, then photographing it before closing it and returning it to its position. Some cases she opened multiple times, coming back to them with the accumulated context of what came before and after, checking her descriptions for accuracy. The collection was not uniform. That was the first significant finding, and she had half expected, in some unreflective corner of her mind, that the room would contain a single type of material, a single category of gem that her father had accumulated with singular focus. What she found was considerably more complex. Diamonds dominated, yes, but they were not all the same. There were parcels of rough diamonds alongside cut stones, the rough material ranging from small industrial-grade fragments to pieces of significant size and visible quality. The cut stones ranged from modest rounds to larger examples in cuts she could not name, but recognized from looking at photographs online as antique or unusual, styles that suggested an earlier era of gem cutting rather than contemporary commercial production. There were also non-diamond materials. Several cases on the 3rd shelf held what appeared to be colored stones, a deep blue in some instances, a vivid and saturated green in others, a rich, warm red in a case whose velvet lining was intact and still held the impressions of stones long seated there. She had no confident way to identify these and did not attempt to. She recorded their colors, their approximate sizes, their cut styles, and left judgment to the specialist. One container, A long, flat case of reinforced leather with brass fittings and a combination lock she could not open sat at the end of the bottom shelf. It was the heaviest individual piece in the room, which she registered by attempting to lift it from the shelf. It moved perhaps 2 inches before she set it back down. Whatever was inside, it was dense enough that the container required genuine effort to manage. By the end of her 4th visit, and she had opened and documented 53 of the room's 61 identified cases and containers. The 8 she had not opened were the leather combination case and 7 others whose clasps or latches had seized with age or moisture and would require tools she had not brought. She photographed each of the unopened ones in detail, noting their external characteristics, their approximate weight as she tested them with her hands, their position on the shelves. She filled 2 complete notebooks. The night before Dr. Fenwick's visit, Nora sat at the kitchen table with both notebooks open in front of her and tried, with the information available to her, to form a rough estimate of what she was dealing with. She had no framework for this that she could trust. She knew what individual diamonds sold for in retail contexts, but retail contexts bore only the most tenuous relationship to wholesale or estate values, and even those figures existed on a spectrum so wide as to be nearly useless without specific information about individual stones. What she did know, looking at the photographs she had accumulated and the description she had written, was that the room did not contain a modest collection. It contained a substantial one. The sheer number of cases, the size of individual stones she had seen, the density of the material, all pointed toward a value that exceeded any framework she had previously applied to her own life. She closed the notebooks, stacked them, and placed them in the bag she would bring the next morning. She slept better that night than she had slept in weeks. She did not analyze why, as she suspected it had something to do with the particular relief of having done the preparation correctly, of having approached a large and uncertain thing in the only way she knew how to approach large and uncertain things, with patience, with documentation, with the conviction that careful attention was the only reliable foundation for whatever came next. Dr. Fenwick arrived in a gray sedan at 9 in the morning. She was a small woman in her late 50s with close-cut silver hair and the specific quality of alertness that belongs to people who have spent their careers looking at things very closely. She wore no jewelry, which Nora noticed and found appropriate. She carried a professional case whose contents she did not immediately open, and she shook Nora's hand at the gate with a brevity and firmness that suggested she was already thinking about the work ahead. They drove in Nora's car up the lane to the shed. Nora opened the doors, moved the shelving unit, opened the room. She stood back and let the specialist enter first. Dr. Fenwick's reaction to what she saw was the most carefully controlled response Nora had ever witnessed from another person. She stood in the doorway for a full 30 seconds, her eyes moving along the shelves with a systematic attention that was itself a kind of assessment, taking inventory before touching anything. Then she set her case on the floor, opened it, and began to remove instruments. She worked for 4 hours without significant interruption. Nora sat outside the hidden room, in the shed itself, on an overturned crate she had found in the corner, and waited. She did not try to watch over the specialist's shoulder. She brought a book she did not read. She listened to the sounds of examination, the small mechanical clicks of instruments, the occasional soft sound of a case being opened or closed, and she waited with the practiced patience of someone who had learned that the most important information arrives in its own time, regardless of how urgently it is required. At intervals, Dr. Fenwick emerged from the room to collect instruments from her case or to ask Nora brief, specific questions. Had she moved any of the material since discovering it? No. Did she know anything about the origin of the collection? No. Was she aware of any insurance records or inventory documents related to the property? No. And the questions were informative in their shape. They told Nora what the specialist was seeing without telling her what she was concluding, which was exactly the kind of controlled information release she would have adopted herself in the same position. At the end of the fourth hour, Dr. Fenwick came out of the room and sat on a second crate that Nora had positioned nearby. She removed her magnifying equipment and set it in her case. She took a slow breath. She looked at Nora directly. "What I can tell you today," she said, "is preliminary. Full authentication of a collection this size, this varied, and of this complexity requires laboratory analysis, provenance research, and significantly more time than one morning." She paused. "But I want you to understand the scope of what you have, and because that will affect the decisions you make in the near term, and I think you are the kind of person who makes better decisions with complete information." Nora said nothing. She waited. "The diamonds," Dr. Fenwick continued, "are real. That much I can confirm with confidence using the instruments I brought. The cut stones include a significant number of high-clarity, high-color examples that would be considered exceptional by any commercial standard. Several of the pieces I examined are consistent in cut style with pre-20th century production, which suggests either that they have been in private hands for a very long time or that they were acquired from estate sources. The rough material includes some pieces of notable size and quality. The colored stones I could access appear to be natural, not treated. I saw what I believe are sapphires, emeralds, and rubies, at least two of which, if my initial assessment is accurate, are of museum-relevant quality." She paused again, in the way a person pauses when they are being careful with language. The container I was not able to open. She gestured toward the room. "Can you tell me anything about it?" Nora shook her head. "I couldn't open it either. The combination lock." Dr. Fenwick nodded. "Its weight and dimensions are consistent with a significant volume of dense material. I cannot speculate beyond that. But I want you to factor it into your understanding that the collection as a whole is not one portion of which is clearly exceptional and the rest unremarkable. Every shelf I examined held material of genuine quality. This is not a collection assembled casually or purchased from ordinary commercial channels. Where would something like this come from? Nora asked. The specialist considered. Collections of this character, assembled over time, typically originate from one or a combination of three sources. Private acquisition from estate sales or auctions, often across many years. Direct trade or purchase from mining sources, which requires either industry connections or significant capital. Or acquisition through channels that were not strictly regulated, which can mean many things and requires investigation rather than assumption. She looked at Nora steadily. I am not drawing conclusions. I am telling you what the investigation will need to address. Nora absorbed this without visible reaction, and then she asked the question she had been waiting to ask for 4 hours. Can you give me a preliminary range of value? Dr. Fenwick was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I can tell you a range so broad it will feel almost meaningless at this stage. But I will tell you, because the upper end of that range is something you need to understand is real and not speculative. She paused once more. Based on what I was able to assess today, a preliminary and necessarily imprecise estimate for the accessible contents of this room alone is between $250 million and $400 million. That range will tighten as authentication proceeds. It may move in either direction, but I do not expect it to fall below the lower figure. And I would not be surprised to see it approach or exceed the upper one when the locked container and full provenance are accounted for. The number landed without drama in the cold air of the shed. Nora did not move. She looked at the open door of the room, at the shelves visible through it, at the cases sitting in the careful order she had first found them and had maintained through 4 visits of her own. She thought about the conference room, about the folding table and the bad lighting, about Harold Whitmore reading from a document in his measured voice, about Gerald asking about timelines, about the figure of slightly under $22,000 attached to this property in an estate document that her brothers had signed. She said, Thank you for telling me directly. Dr. Fenwick nodded. I will need to return, she said. And I will need to involve a small number of trusted colleagues for the laboratory work and the provenance research. Everything conducted under confidentiality agreement, which I will prepare for your review." She looked at Nora. "I would also strongly recommend that you consult a lawyer before anything else moves forward." "I intend to," Nora said. She drove Dr. Fenwick back to the gate and watched the gray sedan turn onto the road. Then she drove back up the lane and sat in the car in front of the shed for a long time, her hands resting in her lap, the engine off. The spring air was still. A pair of birds passed over the tree line at the property's edge, their movement quick and clean against the pale sky. Somewhere farther along the road, a tractor was moving through a field, and its sound carrying in the particular way that sounds carry in open country, clear and distinct across a distance that would surprise you. She did not feel the way she had imagined a person would feel in this moment. There was no euphoria, no sudden giddy lightness, no overwhelming rush of vindication. What she felt was something much quieter and in some ways much more unsettling. It was the feeling of scale, of standing at the base of something too large to see the top of yet, knowing that it was real and that it was going to require everything she had to manage it correctly. She had been careful. She would continue to be careful, but carefulness alone was no longer sufficient. The specialist had named the thing she had been circling for weeks, and had given it numbers large enough to attract forces that no amount of personal caution could hold at bay indefinitely. What had been hers and hers alone, contained in a concrete room behind a shelving unit on a half-acre of property nobody wanted, was about to become something that the world would try to take a position on. She needed a lawyer. She needed the right lawyer. She needed, most urgently, to decide what she was going to do about her brothers. That last consideration was the one she had been setting aside with the greatest effort. It pressed back against her restraint now with an increased force, no longer manageable by simple deferral. The question of whether Gerald or Thomas had known about the room was no longer merely a matter of family history or emotional reckoning. If either of them had known, and the estate division was not a legal document imperfectly drawn, but a fraud. That word did not arrive lightly. Fraud was a legal designation with consequences, and those consequences ran in both directions. They could protect her. They could also complicate everything if misapplied. She drove home through the afternoon, through the fields beginning to green and the sky still high and pale and composed. She stopped at the same gas station she had used on the morning of the estate meeting and bought the same cup of coffee she had barely touched that day. She stood beside the car and drank it slowly, looking out over the road. She called the lawyer recommended by a colleague at work, a man who handled property and estate matters with a reputation for both precision and discretion. She had researched him the previous week without yet making contact. She reached his office on the first call and left a message describing her situation in the minimal terms it was possible to use while still conveying that it was serious and time-sensitive. She gave her name and number and said she would be available at his earliest convenience. He called back that evening. She told him the essential facts without embellishment, the estate division, the property she had received, the hidden room, the specialist's preliminary assessment. She described the numbers Dr. Fenwick had provided. She said them plainly, the way she said all important numbers, without softening or qualification, because numbers were only useful when they were accurate. There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. And then the lawyer said, "How soon can you come in?" She went in the next morning. His name was David Osei, and he had the kind of focused attention that reminded Nora of her own professional manner. The quality of listening that does not perform itself, but simply occurs, absorbing information without visible reaction, and returning it in more organized form. He asked her to go through the sequence of events from the beginning, which she did, using the notebooks as reference. He asked clarifying questions that were precise enough to suggest he was building a structure in his mind rather than simply gathering data. When she had finished, he sat back in his chair and said, "There are two distinct legal questions here, and they need to be handled separately before they can be handled together." She asked him to explain. "The first question," he said, Ike is the status of what you found. You own the property, which means in principle, you own what is on it and within it. But ownership of a collection of this type is rarely straightforward. Diamonds of significant value, particularly those that may have moved through non-regulated channels, can carry encumbrances, historical claims, or provenance complications that create competing interests. Before you can assert ownership cleanly, the collection's history needs to be established, and any such claims either resolved or confirmed as absent. And the second question? She asked. The second question, he said carefully, is whether the estate division was conducted in good faith. He let that phrase settle before continuing. If either of your brothers or any party to the estate process, he had knowledge of the hidden room and its contents at the time the estate was divided, and that knowledge was deliberately withheld during proceedings, the distribution could be challenged as fraudulent concealment. That is a serious allegation with significant consequences, but it is not an allegation you make without evidence. Evidence of prior knowledge would need to be established through a process of its own. He looked at her steadily. Do you have any reason to believe either of your brothers knew? She said, I have one reason to believe one of them might have. She told him about the padlock, the new lock on the shed door, its age relative to the shed's overall condition, the fact that someone had replaced it within the past several years, during a period when her father's health had already been declining and his capacity to manage the property himself had been limited. Someone had gone to the property and changed the lock. That could be her father. But it was also possible it was someone else, someone who had access to the property, who knew the shed was worth securing. Osei made a note. He did not offer a conclusion. He said that establishing who had changed the lock, if it was possible to establish at all, would require investigation that he could help organize, but that would take time. In the meantime, he said, her priority needed to be the authentication process and the parallel legal work of establishing her clean ownership of the collection. Those two things needed to be in place before anything involving her brothers could be meaningfully addressed, because without them, she had no stable platform from which to act. She nodded. She had reached the same conclusion herself and found it slightly easier to hear it confirmed by someone else. He asked her whether she had told anyone other than him and the specialist about the room. She said she had not. He said, keep it that way as long as you can, not forever, but for now. The moment this becomes known beyond a controlled circle, you will lose the ability to manage the pace of what follows, and the pace matters. She drove home from his office that afternoon with a list of next steps that occupied 2 pages of a new notebook. She had expected to feel relieved by the meeting, steadied by having professional guidance in place. She did feel those things, partially, but beneath them was something else. As a growing awareness that the situation had crossed a threshold from which there was no comfortable retreat. She had taken it out of the concrete room. She had put it in the hands of specialists and lawyers. She had named it in a figure that Dr. Fenwick would now carry in her professional memory. The room was no longer just hers. What had been hidden for decades had been found. And what is found cannot be unfound. She understood that with the same clear certainty she applied to every irreversible fact in her working life. The question was no longer whether the world would learn what was in that room. The question was how it would learn, and in what order, and what she would have built before it did. She thought about Gerald. She thought about the padlock. She thought about Margot, who was 11 years old and perceptive and who deserved, without having any current knowledge of it, a future that was not governed by the same margins her mother had navigated for her entire adult life. She turned onto the street where the apartment building stood and parked, sat for a moment in the car, felt the weight of what she was carrying, its actual dimensions now known in a way they had not been even a week ago. Then she got out, climbed the stairs, and knocked on her neighbor's door to collect her daughter, who had been there after school, who ran out with the natural energy of a child at the end of a contained day, who did not know that her mother had spent the week standing at the edge of something enormous and had chosen each time to stay steady. That evening they cooked dinner together. And Margot talked about her day with the detailed enthusiasm of someone for whom each day was still full of new events. And Nora listened and asked questions and answered the ones that came back to her and felt the ordinary architecture of their life around her like something both fragile and enduring. Later, after Margot was in bed, Nora sat at the kitchen table with the new notebook open. She wrote at the top of the page, in her careful hand, what we know. Then she listed what they knew. Then she turned the page and wrote what we need to establish. Then she listed that. The second list was longer, but both lists were finite. Both could be worked through. Every item on both pages was subject to the same process she had applied to every complicated account she had ever reconciled: attention, sequence, documentation, and time. And she would give it all of those things. In the southern part of the county, 40 minutes down quiet roads, the shed stood on the half-acre in the spring evening, its new padlock holding the doors closed, its shelving unit sitting flush against the back wall, its hidden room still and dry and full of cases arranged in careful rows in the dark. It had waited 40 years. It could wait a little longer. She closed the notebook and went to bed, and this time, sleep came without difficulty. What followed the next 3 weeks was a process of controlled revelation that Nora managed with the same methodical precision she brought to everything she valued. Dr. Fenwick returned twice, each time accompanied by a single colleague, and a gemologist with laboratory credentials and a provenance researcher whose specialty was tracking the movement of high-value materials through private hands over long periods. Both signed confidentiality agreements before they saw the room. Both worked with the contained professionalism of people who had navigated sensitive estate situations before and understood what they required. The laboratory analysis confirmed what Dr. Fenwick had indicated in her initial assessment. The diamonds were genuine. The quality distribution across the collection was exceptional, not uniform, but weighted significantly toward the upper range of color and clarity grades. Several individual stones were identified as belonging to categories of rarity that caused the gemologist to photograph them separately and annotate her files with references to comparable examples in institutional collections. The colored stones received particular attention. 3 pieces, a cashmere sapphire of unusual size, an unheated Colombian emerald in a cut consistent with late 19th century production, and a Burmese ruby whose color saturation the gemologist described in her notes with a single underlining rather than additional adjectives, were flagged as requiring specialist independent verification before any valuation could be considered final. The provenance researcher, a quiet woman who wore the same expression of alert concentration throughout both her visits that Dr. Fenwick had worn on the first, I took detailed photographs and measurements of these 3 pieces and departed with extensive notes. The locked leather case was addressed on the second visit. A locksmith Nora had located through OSE, vetted and bound by confidentiality, attended specifically for this purpose. The combination mechanism had seized partially but was not broken. The locksmith worked for 40 minutes with instruments Nora had never seen before, and when the case finally opened, it did so with the sound of a mechanism releasing something it had held for a very long time. Inside, nested in a formed interior of dense protective foam, lay a single piece. It was a rough diamond, uncut in its natural octahedral crystal form, its surface irregular in the way that natural crystals are, the texture of its facets visible even in the flashlight beam. Now, its color was faintly warm, not the blue-white of the purest specimens, but not the yellow of lesser stones. The size of it was what arrested everyone in the room for a long moment of shared silence. The gemologist reached in and carefully lifted it with both hands. It sat in her palms like something that had fallen from a great height and come to rest. She set it down gently and looked at Nora. "I will need time with this," she said. "But I want you to understand that pieces of this size and character are not commonly encountered outside of institutional or national collection contexts. Stones of comparable dimensions that have appeared at auction have done so very rarely and at prices that made international news." Nora looked at the stone in the foam. She thought about her father pointing through a car window at a fence line. She thought about the summer he had mentioned, the one that had seemed full of hidden possibilities. She thought about the shape of a life lived in plain sight, while also containing, for over 40 years, this. She did not ask the gemologist to name a price for the stone. She was not ready for that number yet, and she suspected that the number, once named, would be of a dimension that language struggled to hold without losing precision. They closed the case. Nora locked the room. They drove back to the gate in a quiet that felt earned rather than awkward. It was Osei who brought the first formal complication, and he did it the way he did everything, directly and without softening. He called her on a Thursday afternoon and asked her to come in. She arrived at his office to find a document on his desk that had not been there before. It was a letter from the same law firm that had represented her brothers during the estate process. It was addressed to him in his capacity as her counsel, and it had arrived that morning. He handed it to her, and she read it. The letter stated, in the measured language of a document designed to be legally precise while communicating unmistakable pressure, that Gerald and Thomas Callahan had become aware of certain activities undertaken by their sister on the property located in the southern part of the county, including the engagement of specialist consultants for assessment purposes, and that they wished to assert their interest in any assets discovered on or within structures on said property, pending a review of the estate distribution. Pending a review. She set the letter down. "How did they know?" she said. Osei leaned back in his chair. He said, "Someone talked. It may have been someone on the periphery of the process. The locksmith, a neighbor who noticed the vehicles, someone at the county records office who noticed a property query." He paused. Or it may have been anticipated. She heard the implication in the last sentence. He continued, "The letter is carefully worded. It does not assert specific knowledge of what you found. It asserts interest in what may have been found. There are two ways to read that. Either they genuinely do not know, and this is a precautionary move designed to position them favorably before they do know, or they have always known more than they disclosed, and this is the moment they have decided to surface." She was quiet. He said, "The padlock." She said, "Yes, there's something else," he said. He slid a second sheet across the desk. This came from the county records office. It's a property access log from the archive. She looked at it. He said, "Your father's property was accessed twice in the 2 years before his death for the purpose of a tax assessment query. The requesting party on both occasions was a property management company whose registered owner is a business entity associated with your brother Gerald." She looked at the document for a long time. Gerald had been to the property. Gerald's company had accessed the county records on the property. Gerald had known where the parcel was and had taken the trouble to query it while their father was still alive and declining. The new padlock. Gerald had not merely known about the property. He had visited it. He had, at some point in the years before their father died, stood where she had stood and looked at the shed. Whether he had stood in the room behind the shelving unit was a question she still could not answer. But he had been there. He had assessed it. And then he had sat across from her in a conference room and signed a document that gave it to her at a valuation of $22,000 and walked out without a word. She thought about the word equitable. She thought about the word deliberate. She set the document down and looked at Osei. "What do we do?" she said. He said, "We prepare. We establish your ownership. We complete the authentication. We build the documentation so thoroughly that anyone who contests it does so against a record that leaves no room for ambiguity. and then we respond to their letter. She said, "And the response?" He said, "The response will be simple. We will acknowledge receipt. We will state that the estate distribution was conducted according to a legal document to which all parties were signatories. We will not reveal what has been found. We will not invite negotiation. We will simply confirm that you are the owner of the property, that any activity conducted upon it is conducted within your legal rights as owner, and that any further correspondence on the matter should be directed to this office." He paused. Then he said, "We give them nothing. Not yet." She drove home that evening through a sky beginning to cloud over, the light in the west flattening to a dull orange that turned gray at the edges. She drove the familiar roads back to the town, back to the building, back up the stairs. She made dinner. She helped Margot with homework at the kitchen table, sitting across from her daughter in the ordinary light of the ordinary evening. She did not tell Margot what was happening, not yet. There would be a time for that, and it would come when the foundation beneath what she was building was solid enough to stand on without caution. Until then, she would do what she had always done. She would be the person who was steady when steadiness was required, who was quiet when quietness was the most powerful available response, who was careful in exactly the proportion that the situation demanded. Gerald had seen the shed. He had been to the property. He had known enough to query the records and enough to stay silent in the conference room. But he had not known what the shelving unit concealed, or if he had underestimated the woman across the table. Either way, the mistake had been made, and it could not now be corrected. The estate document was signed. The property was hers. What it contained was hers. What it was worth was becoming day by day clearer and more undeniable, and the process of making it permanently and legally hers was underway with the same methodical force that she brought to every account she had ever balanced. She had been given the shed. She had opened it. What happened next would not be decided by the people who had not thought to look inside. The authentication process concluded on a Tuesday morning in early summer, 11 weeks after Nora had first pressed the right edge of the shelving unit and felt the world shift beneath her hand. Dr. Fenwick delivered the final report in Osei's office. A document of considerable length whose executive summary occupied 2 pages and whose appendices ran to 40 more. She spoke through its principal findings with the same controlled precision she had brought to every previous interaction, and Nora listened the way she had learned to listen to things that mattered, without movement, without reaction, absorbing what was being said into a place deep enough that it would remain accurate long after the meeting ended. The total authenticated value of the collection, accounting for all 61 cases and containers, including the large rough diamond from the sealed leather case, came to $314 million. The figure was expressed as a range with a lower bound of $308 million and an upper bound of $319 million. The variance attributable to the variable nature of colored stone valuations and the as-yet undetermined provenance premium on several exceptional pieces. The rough diamond alone had been assessed by 2 independent experts, whose combined opinion placed it among the 20 largest known gem-quality rough diamonds to have passed through private hands in the 20th century. The provenance research had been completed in parallel. What it established was that the collection had been assembled by her father across a period of approximately 38 years, acquired through a combination of estate purchases, private transactions, and direct acquisition from brokers operating in the legitimate secondary market. The researcher had found no evidence of theft, no outstanding claims from institutional collections, no flags in the databases maintained by international law enforcement for the purpose of tracking displaced cultural property. The collection was, in the technical language of the report, clean. Nora's legal ownership, Osei had already established through separate proceedings, was not in question. The property was hers. What was on it and within it was hers. The estate distribution was a signed legal document. Nothing in it had been conditional. Gerald's letter had been followed by two more, each somewhat more pointed than the last, and finally by a formal legal complaint filed through the probate division, asserting that the estate distribution had failed to account for a material asset and seeking a court order to compel an inventory and reassessment. The complaint named the hidden room. By that point, the existence of the room had been established enough through the county records process that concealing it would have served no purpose. What the complaint could not establish, and what Gerald's attorneys discovered only gradually and with increasing frustration, was knowledge. To challenge the distribution, Gerald needed to demonstrate either that the estate document had been improperly drafted, which it had not, or that there had been fraudulent concealment, which required proving that someone with authority over the estate had known of the room and deliberately withheld it. The problem was that the only person who had definitively known was Robert Callahan himself, who was beyond the reach of any proceeding, and who had, in the final arrangement of his affairs, chosen to make the property available without restriction to the person to whom he gave it. There was also, by that point, the matter of the padlock. Osei's investigator had traced the lock through its purchase record to a small hardware store 30 miles from the county, and the purchase had been made on a card associated with Gerald's property management company 18 months before Robert Callahan's death. The lock had been changed by Gerald. He had been to the shed. He had changed the lock and said nothing to the estate process, nothing to Whitmore, nothing to Nora. Whether he had been inside the room was a question whose answer remained uncertain, but whether he had known the shed warranted securing, that question had been answered clearly and in writing. Osei presented this finding in the response to the complaint with the same economy of language he applied to everything. He did not editorialize. He did not allege. He set the evidence in sequence, allowed the court to observe its implications, and stated that in light of Gerald Callahan's documented engagement with the property prior to the estate division, any claim of surprise regarding the property's characteristics was difficult to sustain. The complaint was withdrawn 6 weeks after it was filed. Gerald did not call her. Thomas sent a text message that said he hoped things could remain civil. She read it once and set her phone on the kitchen table and did not respond for 3 days. When she did, she wrote 2 words. They were not unkind words. They were not warm ones either. They were simply the words of a person who had decided that the energy required for either warmth or unkindness was better used elsewhere. She told Margot on a Saturday afternoon in July, sitting on the small balcony of the apartment with 2 glasses of lemonade between them and the summer light coming in low and gold through the buildings across the street. She had thought carefully about how to do this and had decided, as she decided most things, that the right way was the plain way. She told her daughter that her grandfather had left something valuable on the property in the south of the county, something hidden, and that she had found it, and that it meant their lives were going to change in some significant ways. Margot listened with the serious attention she had inherited from somewhere in the family line, her elbows on her knees, but her eyes on her mother's face. "How significant," she said. Nora told her the number. There was a silence of perhaps 15 seconds, which was, Nora would reflect later, an extraordinary amount of poise from an 11-year-old confronting a number of that size for the first time. Then Margot said, "Does that mean we don't have to worry anymore?" And Nora felt something move through her chest that was not quite grief and not quite relief, but carried the weight of both, the particular feeling of a question that has been asked in simplicity about something that has never been simple and that deserves an honest answer. She said, "Yes, that's what it means." Margot nodded slowly. Then she picked up her lemonade and looked out at the street below, and after a moment she said, "Grandpa was pretty quiet about things, wasn't he?" The Nora looked at the street too. "He was," she said. They sat there together in the summer light for a while, not talking, the sound of the street below carrying up to them, ordinary and constant and entirely unchanged. The changes that followed were not dramatic in their form. Nora had thought about this carefully during the months of the authentication and legal process, during the evenings at the kitchen table with the notebooks and the lists, and she had arrived at a set of convictions that she held to with the same firmness she applied to everything she valued. She did not want excess. She had never wanted excess. What she wanted, what she had always wanted, was the absence of pressure. The margin. The space between what was required and what was available, at that small but crucial distance that changes the character of every decision you make. She paid off the debts, all of them, entirely and immediately, with the clean satisfaction of closing accounts that had been open too long. The credit balance that had accumulated during a period of car repairs and Margot's unexpected medical costs in the previous year. The remainder of a small personal loan she had taken 4 years ago when the gap in her budget had required bridging. Gone. Closed. The relief was so quiet and so complete that she had to sit down when she did it, not from the weight of the moment, but from the sudden lightness of a burden she had carried so long she had forgotten it was there. She found them a house, not large, not in any sense ostentatious. A house with a garden and a second bedroom for Margot that did not share a wall with the kitchen, and a room on the ground floor she could use as an office, and enough of a yard that the summer evenings had somewhere to go. The neighborhood was modest and unremarkable in the way that she had always preferred unremarkable, a place where the ordinary life she intended to continue living would not be conspicuous. She did not change her job immediately. She thought about it, turned it over for several weeks, and concluded that she was not ready to remove the structure it provided. The work was not exciting, but it was hers, and she had learned that the things that are yours, even the quiet ones, carry a value that is not always visible in their surface. She negotiated a reduction in her hours, allowing for 2 days a week of flexibility, and used that time for things she had been deferring for years. Long walks, reading without guilt, sitting with Margot in the afternoons after school rather than only in the evenings. She established a trust for Margot's education and future, constructed with Osei's guidance to be solid and unambiguous and beyond the reach of circumstances. She made a contribution to 2 organizations her father had supported quietly for years, the ones named in his estate document, writing the checks with a feeling she could not entirely name, the feeling perhaps of a conversation continued after one of its participants has left the room. The collection itself was dispersed gradually, through legitimate auction channels and private sales, each transaction handled with the documentation and legal care that its scale required. And the large rough diamond was the last piece to go, sold to a private collector whose identity Nora did not know and did not seek to know, the transaction conducted through an intermediary with the same confidentiality that had characterized every other step of the process. The figure it achieved, communicated to her in a brief message from Osei on a Wednesday morning as she was making coffee, was one she read twice before setting her phone down on the counter and standing very still for a moment. Then she poured the coffee and drank it. She returned to the shed only once after everything was concluded. It was autumn by then, the trees at the property's boundary beginning to turn, the long grass gone gray-gold in the cooling air. She had not decided what to do with the land yet, and was not rushing toward a decision. These things, and she had come to understand, revealed themselves more clearly when approached without urgency. She walked the lane from the gate and stood in front of the shed for a while. The doors were unlocked now, the brass padlock gone, the door swinging open easily when she pushed it. Inside, the room behind the shelving unit was empty. The shelves were bare. The cases were gone, moved through channels and processes and legal recordings into new contexts and new hands. The pivot mechanism still worked when she pressed the right edge of the unit, the smooth arc of its movement unchanged, engineered so well that decades had done nothing to diminish its precision. She stood in the hidden room for the last time and looked at the empty shelves. The concrete walls were the same. The ventilation grill in the ceiling was the same. And the electrical conduit ran along the same path it had always run, its bulb still dead, the fixture still intact. The room was exactly as it had been when she first stood in the doorway with her flashlight, except that it was empty, and that difference was the measure of everything that had happened in between. She thought about her father building this room. She thought about him in that summer he had mentioned, the one full of hidden possibilities, and she tried to imagine what it had looked like to him from where he stood. A young man with patience and a plan and a particular conviction about where value resided. Not in the obvious places, not in the things people pointed to and assessed from the road, in the things that required effort to reach, in the things that waited for the right person to go looking. She had gone looking, not for treasure. She had gone looking because something did not add up, and she was constitutionally unable to leave an account unbalanced. She had gone looking the way she did everything, without drama, without performance, with the quiet and unfashionable conviction that careful attention was its own form of courage. Her father had known that about her. She believed that now. He had known it in the way that parents sometimes know things about their children that the children do not yet know about themselves. He had left her the shed, the half-acre, the overgrown land assessed at $22,000, and he had trusted that she would do what Gerald had not thought to do, what Thomas had not considered, what neither of them, in their calculations and their timelines and their carefully managed inheritance, he had ever imagined was possible. He had trusted her to look. She walked out of the room and pushed the shelving unit back into its position. She walked out of the shed and pulled the doors closed behind her. She stood in the autumn air on the overgrown land, half an acre of grass going to seed and bramble settling in its corner and saplings reaching toward the light. She had not decided what to do with it yet. She thought she might keep it, not build on it, not sell it, not clear it or develop it or turn it into anything that required a plan and a crew and a set of intentions imposed from outside. She thought she might simply maintain it, keep the fence, keep the gate, let the grass grow and the saplings reach, and the seasons do what seasons do to a piece of ground that has been left to its own rhythm. But her father had kept it for 40 years without developing it. She understood now that that patience had been its own kind of statement. She locked the gate behind her and drove home through the autumn afternoon, through the fields and the pale sky and the roads she had come to know in their smallest variations over the months of driving them. She drove the way she drove everything now, without the low-grade urgency that had once accompanied every trip, every decision, every Tuesday and Thursday and ordinary morning of a life conducted at the edge of its own margins. She had margin now. She had space. She had the particular quiet that comes not from absence of difficulty, but from the knowledge that difficulty, when it comes, will not be the last word. Margot was home when she arrived, doing homework at the kitchen table of the house, and her school books arranged with a neatness she had not been asked to develop and that Nora recognized as her own trait returned in a different form. She looked up when her mother came in and said something about her day, something ordinary and immediate. The kind of thing children say when the world is functioning as it should and there is nothing requiring special attention. Nora listened. She asked a question. She put the kettle on. The kitchen was warm, and the light outside was the amber of autumn afternoons, and somewhere in the south of the county, a shed stood on half an acre, with its shelves empty and its pivot mechanism as precise as the day it was built. And somewhere in the past, a man had planned a long time ahead of his own need and trusted that the person he chose would find what he had left and know what to do with it. And she had found it. She had known what to do, and now she stood in her kitchen in the amber light and made tea, and listened to her daughter talk, and the margin between what was required and what was available stretched out around her like open ground, wide and unhurried and entirely hers. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.